With another shooting, there's another call from the Biden administration for more regulations on guns. How constitutional is that? We are going to talk about that today on Stopping Socialism TV. But before we do, I need to urge everyone to help us get this content out there. Google, Facebook, all the social medias there are not doing us any favors. So we need your help to kind of spread this message out there. You know, hit the like button, share this content with friends and family and all of that good stuff. Otherwise, you're going to be the only one watching this video. And what's the fun in that? So, Justin, I had seen this article that you had recently published here on The Hill that is titled, "According to the Founders, All Federal Gun Restrictions Are Unconstitutional." Did you lose your mind, or is this is this based in reality?
Well, some people, it's quite a question to ask. Yeah,
you're not answering the question. Let the record show.
Yeah, basically, there are a lot of people out there who would say that this is like totally insane. There are even people on the right who would say, you know, you're just like, you've gone too far here. The idea that we can't have any, you know, gun laws at all. Is that really the world that you're trying to build here? And the truth is, I think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding about both what I'm trying to argue and what the founding fathers believe. So before we get started on the details of this, I think it's important we get that out of the way right from the very start. That fundamental misunderstanding is that when the founding fathers created the United States of America, and for really the first 100 years or so of the country's history, the federal constitution applied to federal law. It did not apply to state laws. So the Second Amendment, when it was created, was designed to prohibit the federal government from having any kind of gun law at all. Okay, that was the idea. That did not mean that they were trying to create a country with absolutely no gun laws. They just thought that states and local governments would be the ones that pass these gun laws, and that the federal government would not be able to pass these gun laws. All right. Later on in America's history, Supreme Courts started what they call incorporating the Bill of Rights, including the Second Amendment, over a long period of time through a bunch of different Supreme Court cases. They started incorporating the Bill of Rights into the state law so that states can't do things that violate the federal constitution as well. But that was not what the founding fathers had in mind. Okay. So when I say that the founding fathers made it very clear that the federal constitution banned federal government from having any kind of gun law at all, I am 100% confident that was the case, but I'm not trying to argue that there should be no gun laws at all anywhere in America. That's not what they had in mind. That's not what I had in mind. So it's important to get that straight. All right. So the main source, I mean, it is amazing to me that anybody disagrees with me on this at all. There is a incredible amount of information, historical information, that shows that during the period that the founding fathers were debating the Constitution, putting together the Second Amendment, talking about whether a Second Amendment was even necessary, they repeatedly, over and over and over again, noted that they needed to have some kind of protection in the Constitution that guaranteed that if you had a tyrannical federal government, there would be some way for the states and local communities to fight back against that tyrannical federal government. You have to understand that in the context of this period of time, when they're building the Constitution, the states saw themselves as individual, essentially, countries. And they were worried that if they gave up their sovereignty to create the United States of America, that they would be just building a whole new monarchy. You know, they just got rid of the monarch. They didn't want another monarch, right? And so they were very concerned, well, what happens if we give up our sovereignty? We in, Virginia or North Carolina or XYZ state give up our sovereignty. We create this federal government, and the federal government goes crazy and starts, being a tyrant. What do we do? how do we fight back? How do we make sure that we have the ability to stop that from happening? And the Second Amendment was the main way of ensuring that was going to take place. So there's all sorts of evidence that supports this claim. I think the Second Amendment itself is extremely plain.
Yeah, shall not be infringed is pretty clear.
Is exactly right. A well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. Okay, so what this is saying is the right of the people to keep and bear arms, meaning firearms, shall not be infringed. That's very straightforward. The justification that comes before it, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, is often used, manipulated by people in the debate to say, well, this is only talking about militia. Only militia have this right. Right? And that's who they're talking about. The thing that people miss, though, which is so obvious, and within the context of them writing this would have been apparent to everybody at the time the Second Amendment was written, is that militia were composed of individual people who owned their own guns.
Yeah.
So you couldn't have a well-regulated militia without individual gun ownership. That was, everybody knows the Minutemen, right? Like people have heard, everybody's grown up in history class. They talk about the Minutemen and Lexington and Concord and all that stuff. Those were just regular people with guns in their house that walked outside and defended the community. That's what they were. The other thing that people don't understand is that many states at this time, I think, in fact, almost all the states, if I remember right, at this time had laws that said specifically that every male adult between the ages of like 18 and, like 50 or something like that was automatically in the militia. So everyone was in the militia. And in fact, in the Constitution of South Carolina, most people don't know this, but in the Constitution of South Carolina, it's still there. Technically, every male in South Carolina between the ages of 18 and whatever, according to the Constitution, is in the militia. So again, it just reinforces this idea that everyone was basically in the militia. So the idea that the militia, the concept of defending the rights of a militia, to ensure that there was a free state was somehow separate from individual gun ownership doesn't make any sense. The militia were regular people who owned their own guns, number one. Number two, just about every male, and at that time, males were the only, citizens, essentially full citizens of the United States, right? Those people were the only, they were all essentially considered to be in the militia anyway. And so obviously this is trying, just from the text you can see, it's trying to defend individual gun rights, all right? The other thing to keep in mind is that there's a whole bunch of evidence from the writers themselves, from the founding fathers themselves, saying that this is that the Second Amendment and the ability for individuals to own their own guns and the fact that we have state militias is all reasons why people should not be worried about creating this new federal government. And the clearest example of this is from James Madison. James Madison is considered the father of the Constitution. He was the most influential founding father in regards to the creation of the Constitution, negotiating the Bill of Rights, all of that sort of stuff. He wrote in the Federalist Papers, which is a series of essays that was published in newspapers, mostly across the colonies, to try to convince people to support the Constitution and support the creation of America. Because there were a lot of people at the time who were worried about creating the United States. So the idea here was to convince these people, you know what, it's okay for us to create this new federal government. It's going to be all right. And in one of the essays, which he wrote, I believe the same year that the Constitution was ratified, if I remember right, he said, notwithstanding the military establishments in the several kingdoms of Europe, which are carried as far as the public resources will bear, the governments, meaning in Europe, are afraid to trust the people with arms. And it is not certain that with this aid alone, they would not be able to shake off their yokes, meaning even if they had the ability to own arms, maybe they wouldn't be able to get rid of these tyrannical leaders in Europe anyway. He says, but were the people to possess the additional advantages of local governments, so in addition to owning your own guns, having local governments chosen by themselves who could collect the national will and direct the national force, and of officers appointed of the militia by these governments, meaning local militias, okay, with the support from local governments, and attached both to them and to the militia, it may be affirmed with the greatest assurance that the throne of every tyranny in Europe would be speedily overturned in spite of the legions which surrounded it. So what he's saying here clearly is that if we have if the people in Europe had the ability to own weapons, their own arms, and local governments that they elected themselves, they wouldn't have any tyrants in Europe.
Sure.
The tyrants would all be gone. And then he goes on in this same article to talk about how, because there are so many more militiamen, there are so many more state militias and so many more members of militias across the country, if you add them all up in the various states, that we don't have to worry about having a military, a federally controlled military, because all these people, all these militias could all get together and overthrow them. He talks about it in this same essay. So the idea here is very clear. The Second Amendment was meant to give the ability for states and local governments to join together to overthrow a tyrannical government. Federal government. That was the primary justification for it. And then there's all sorts of other quotes in the article that I published in The Hill. Samuel Adams in Massachusetts says, when talking about the importance of having a Bill of Rights, that the Constitution should never be construed to authorize Congress to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms. Then a Supreme Court Justice, Joseph Story, who was put into the Supreme Court by President Madison, wrote that, quote, the militia is the natural defense of a free country against sudden foreign invasions, domestic insurrections, and domestic usurpations of power by rulers. So again, talking about the importance of militias being able to overthrow tyrannical local governments. And the quotes go on and on. There's a million quotes. Thomas Jefferson alone has a million quotes talking about the necessity of people having to own arms, regular people. So this is an open and shut case.
So I've got a couple of questions here for you, though. So you mentioned somewhere in this article that basically up until for the first couple hundred years of the United States, there was no federal restrictions on gun rights. Until 1930 something, you say somewhere in this article, 1930 something. So what happened? Why the sudden change? Because there's obviously a whole rash of gun laws at a federal level since 1930, whatever. So what happened?
Right. So there was, most people don't, this I think is actually maybe one of the best proofs of my argument, that the Second Amendment banned all federal gun laws. There were no federal gun laws until 1934. That was the first national federal gun law put into place. Okay. Up until that time, there were literally no federal gun laws. Not only that, as far as I know, there were no attempts at federal gun laws. It wasn't like there were all these gun laws passed and then courts overthrew them. There weren't any. The Supreme Court didn't even have any cases about this until the 1930s because nobody even bothered to try it because everyone just assumed that that was what the Second Amendment meant. So 1934, you have lots of organized crime. You have, we're talking about Prohibition era organized crime coming out of that. And you've got machine guns and you've got, sort of Al Capone type. These are the days of Al Capone and all of that stuff, right? And following the St. Valentine's Day massacre, a bunch of people got killed, machine guns. It was really awful. They pass a national gun law. This is the Roosevelt administration. This is sort of from the federal executive branch perspective, this is kind of like the height of the progressive era. And Roosevelt puts into place national gun laws with help from Congress. And immediately it was challenged. Mm-hmm. And the challenges were, this is unconstitutional. You can't ban guns. And some of the guns that they banned, I think one of the big ones was sawed-off shotguns. Okay, we're going to ban sawed-off shotguns. So then there's this big Supreme Court case called Miller, and that's is after Roosevelt put in a bunch of justices on the court. And in the Miller case, the Supreme Court rules, because the people who had challenged the law said that you can't ban sawed-off shotguns because we have a Second Amendment right. You're not allowed to create federal gun laws. And so in the Miller case, these progressive judges argued, really in a stunning way, something that's the opposite of what they're arguing today on the left. They said that actually we can have some federal gun laws if the gun law restricts weapons that don't have anything to do with militias or warfare, because the Second Amendment was meant to protect and defend this idea that we would have these militias. Okay, so sawed-off shotguns aren't weapons of war. Therefore, we can have...
Why not?
Of course. Well, of course. It's a stupid argument. But they were looking for a justification for why they could have this law, right? That's the progressive era, is they just look for justifications for rubber stamping things that the Roosevelt administration were doing. There's all sorts of crazy cases that come out of this era, by the way. For example, my favorite case is this case that came out of, I believe it was California originally, Supreme Court case. They ruled, there was this law that allowed the federal government to fine a farmer for growing wheat on his own property. And the argument that that the Supreme Court ended up approving was that the federal government could pass a law that fined a farmer for growing wheat on his own property, even if he doesn't sell it, because under the Interstate Commerce Clause. Now think about that. Interstate commerce. There's no commerce. He's not selling the wheat, and he's not selling it across state lines. So how could it be interstate commerce? But they argued that it is justified under the Interstate Commerce Clause because anytime you grow wheat anywhere, it affects the price of wheat. So because it affects the price of wheat, it applies under the Interstate Commerce Clause. So think about how this is the kind of people that we're talking about here, right? But the point that I'm making is that up until 1939, no Supreme Court ever said that you could do this. And then even when they said you could do it, they used a justification that everybody on the left today would universally condemn, because they would say, well, you can't have weapons of war. You can have a shotgun because that's not a weapon. That's not a really dangerous weapon. But AR-15 rifles, that's too dangerous.
Right,
well, that's the opposite of what they were arguing back in 1939. They were saying you can have weapons of war, but you can't have these other guns that nobody uses in the military. So it's a ridiculous, the history of all this is totally ridiculous. But the point is, there is no evidence whatsoever, zero, that anyone will ever be able to point to that shows that anybody in the early days of America believed that the Second Amendment allowed the federal government to pass gun laws.
Sure.
There's no one who believed that.
So that kind of begs the question, though, because you had mentioned that the Second Amendment was supposed to prevent from any federal laws being passed that infringe upon gun rights. But that opens the door to state laws. So in this scenario, though, Illinois could pass some type of sweeping gun regulation. As long as it's not the federal government, that would have been allowed under the Founding Fathers kind of, rules that they set in place.
Assuming that the state didn't also have a amendment in its constitution banning the same kind of thing. And most of them did. Not all of them have that, but most states actually have a Second Amendment type law in their own constitutions.
Sure.
So the idea was you had a Second Amendment at the state, so to speak, at the state level, protecting you from the state government. And you had a Second Amendment at the federal level protecting you from the federal government. And that was the idea. But if the state wanted to pass a new amendment or not have an amendment at all in the state constitution, or it's not even really an amendment, but if they didn't want to have a protection for it in the state constitution, they didn't have to. And you could have state gun laws, and they did have state gun laws even early on. But what happened was, as we started incorporating the Bill of Rights for all sorts of other things into state laws over a long period of time, eventually conservative type people who support the Second Amendment said, hey, well, if we're going to be incorporating all these other things into the state laws, stopping state governments from doing all kinds of things using the federal constitution, then we should do it for gun rights too. And so Supreme Courts started doing that same exact thing. And that's when you start getting into these cases that occurred, like the Heller case in DC and other things, where the Supreme Court ruled the Second Amendment applies to you, state government and local government. You can't pass strict gun restriction laws at the state level either, because the Second Amendment applies to you as well. But that was so far removed from what the founding fathers understood.
Sure.
So again, all of these things were supposed to be state and local issues. They were not supposed to be a federal issue.
So this is like, very, very interesting article. Obviously, it presents some pretty good evidence. Like you said, I don't know how anyone could really disagree with you when you kind of read through all of these facts.
You'd be surprised.
Well, yeah, of course. but there, there's no real call to action or anything like that at the end. Like, is this just like a novelty thing that you keep on trivia night, to pull this factoid out? Or is there actually, is there something we can do? I don't know if we're going to be able to just like have somebody read this article and be like, well, all federal gun laws are nullified. But, is there anything that we can do to kind of push back against anything in the future? Or what do you think?
Yeah, so I think that Supreme Courts, and right now we have a conservative-leaning Supreme Court. Supreme Courts should stop acting as though federal government has the right to pass any gun laws. They don't. Now, if states want to pass gun laws, that's fine. But the federal government should not be allowed to pass gun laws. It's so crystal clear from the historical evidence. There's no justification for it at all. And so, I think that putting pressure on the Supreme Court, the idea that doesn't work, it does work. It absolutely works. And I think that people should put pressure on Supreme Court justices to make sure that the federal government is not passing a gun law of any kind, because I don't think they have the right to do that. Now, you get into some areas where, for example, if you're selling guns across state lines and stuff like that, like then you do get into interstate commerce and some other things.
Sure.
But if you're just talking about, no, we're just going to ban all AR-15s, you can't do that. I think that's unconstitutional. So that's the first thing. I think that in the long run, though, the reality is, because the vast majority of Americans are never going to support a country where there's no gun laws anywhere. Sure. And that's part of the problem that we have here, is if my interpretation of the Second Amendment is right, and it is, and you want to take that Second Amendment and you want to apply it to states, right, which is what we've done with the First Amendment and all these other amendments, then you can't have any gun laws. Which is why, because states wouldn't be allowed to do it either. Right. So that's why Supreme Courts have done all these ridiculous, maneuvers to try to figure out, even though the Second Amendment seems very obvious, let's find a way to actually reinterpret it so that some gun laws could be allowed for reasons that don't even make any sense. Because they know that if they were going to be consistent, they would have to get rid of all gun laws. So long term, the solution to this is we have to have, really, I think, either a new amendment or a revision of the Second Amendment to make clear that states have the authority to make their own gun laws, but the federal government has absolutely no authority to make any gun laws at all. And that would require a compromise from both sides of the aisle, because the conservative would need to accept that some states will ban guns if we do this. But the flip side to that is the federal government could not ban guns anywhere. Therefore, there are states who would have lots of really no restrictions at all on gun laws, and those states should be allowed to have that.
Yeah, the concept of the laboratories of freedom would be in full effect with this one for sure, because I'm sitting here in Illinois, and surely there'd be some massive regulations on guns.
Correct. And the truth is that my solution is not going to be supported by anybody because the people who are pro-gun rights have decided that nope, Second Amendment applies to everybody, applies to states, applies to local governments, applies to everyone. Therefore, and I'm not giving it up. And the people who hate guns say, no, this is only for militias and National Guard, and no one is allowed to own any guns at all. And we think that's fine. The Second Amendment. And so no one will ever compromise on this.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. And so we're gonna have this debate for literally forever. It's never going to go away because no one will ever be willing to just compromise and pass a new amendment that allows for both sides to live peacefully in the same country. We can't have that because we have to impose our will on everyone else. That's the modern America.
And we'll be here talking about it constantly because, like you said, this debate will go on forever. And you've got politicians like Joe Biden currently that's going to be out there pushing some new, probably executive orders, but surely some legislation will follow as well. And we'll be here at Stopping Socialism TV to talk about every update as it comes through. Justin, any last words on this topic before we wrap up this segment?
No last words on this topic, but I do want to point out that we have a totally new design for the show. And it looks amazing. I think it looks really good. I also want everyone to know, first of all, Donnie made the design, so he deserves all the credit in the world on that. The other thing is, though, that it took us forever to actually produce this video. So please subscribe to us, if for no other reason than you feel bad. Feel bad for us, and please subscribe because it took us literally hours to do this.
Yeah. Well, as Justin noted, we are kind of not rebranding, but putting a fresh coat of paint on everything. We got some new software we're trying out, and yes, it did take us a while to get it set up here. You probably noticed kind of a lack of videos in the past few months, but we're going to kick it up a notch. I think we got everything in motion here. I think we got everything kind of set. So the next video shouldn't take as long to come out, and we're going to be doing some good stuff here in the next few months. So stay tuned. Subscribe to us here on YouTube, Stopping Socialism TV. You can follow us on all different social medias. Just look up Stopping Socialism. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, Parler, pretty much everywhere. And go to stoppingsocialism.com for all of our news and commentary. Justin, where can people find your stuff?
At Justin T. Haskins on Facebook and Socialist Twitter and Parler.
All right. Thank you all for tuning in. We will talk to you next time.